Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. An issue has really taken over the first little time of the Toronto mayoralty campaign that I was actually, frankly, a lot surprised with, which is Ontario Place and the Ontario Science Centre. And should one be turned into a spa, and should the other one be relocated to Ontario Place? I thought there were a lot of other really more important issues facing what's going on in Toronto, but this issue is sort of taken over. So I thought it would be interesting to reach out to an expert in this area. And he wrote a really quite interesting article on the topic just last week in Azure magazine. Stefan Novakovic is a Toronto-based journalist. He's specializing in architecture and urbanism, and he is the senior editor of Azure magazine. Stefan, thanks so much for joining us tonight.
Brian, it's a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Why does this make any sense to relocate the Science Centre to Ontario Place? Like, why? Please tell me.
Well, you know what? I think it's a sort of complicated political issue that the Doug Ford government got themselves into, frankly, which is that it all starts with the Ontario Place plan on the waterfront, which was pretty controversial to begin with, right? And so there's this plan to partner with an Austrian sort of spa and water park developer called the Therm Group to essentially privatize Ontario Place or semi-privatize it to create a sort of water park attraction on the waterfront. And this plan immediately proved really unpopular for the Ford government and for all the companies working with it, and became a sort of hot button issue for anybody running for mayor. And as time went on, that debate just intensified, especially in sort of the world I operate in, which is architecture and urbanism. Sort of people are really passionate about preserving Ontario Place. And then one of the solutions that sort of emerged from that for the government, and I believe for one of the mayoral candidates, Anna Bailão, who suggested a similar type of thing, is, well, let's do that, but then let's also preserve Ontario Place by moving the Science Centre into it. Now, Brian, if you're kind of confused by how all that sort of works, I am too, because it sort of feels like the government and everybody involved, and Doug Ford's now signed on to this plan, is just sort of digging themselves into a deeper hole, trying to sort of fix the mess over Ontario Place by moving the Science Centre down there, which is actually just making folks a lot more upset and a lot more confused about what the government actually wants to do.
I have had some experience in politics, and I think one of the negative things about politics at times is when you get in trouble, they have this line about change the channel. And I really worry that there's so many important issues facing Toronto today, whether it be a fiscal crisis or a housing affordability crisis, we could go on, a safety crisis in the TTC and elsewhere, that this attention to the Science Centre and Ontario Place is really a distraction and takes the mayoralty candidates and the campaign discussion off of what are really important long-term issues for Toronto. That said, it also is a change of the channel, as you say, for the issue of whether this big spa makes sense at Ontario Place, because all of a sudden people end up spending way too much time talking about the Science Centre rather than the spa. Let's talk about each of these issues in a little bit detail, if we could. I understand that there was quite a extensive open letter sent to the Premier and the province of Ontario from numerous different architects talking about the architectural importance of the Science Centre. It won an award in the centennial year when it was first announced and built. Tell me, is there any architectural significance to the Science Centre?
Oh, absolutely. I think that people in the architectural field, myself included, feel a great deal of fondness for it. I think, for one thing, it's a really sort of historically important building that set a kind of paradigm for what a museum can be. Before the era of the Science Centre, when we thought about a museum, we thought of sort of looking at stuff behind glass cases or behind velvet ropes. And it was one of the first institutions in the world that was built to be interactive. That's one of the reasons why so many school field trips still take place there to this day. It was built as a museum where you could learn not just by looking at things, but by feeling them, by touching them. And for the architect Raymond Moriyama, that was a big sort of part of the educational process. He thought that things would really stick with people, especially with young people, with children, to learn that way. So the whole building was sort of designed to support that. And for that, that has some historical importance. But, one might say, as a sort of ordinary Ontarian who's not, really particularly invested in the field of architecture, why should most folks care? Especially since it's a really sort of concrete heavy building that was built in the brutalist style, which isn't particularly popular with the public. But if you spend some time there, it really is quite a memorable experience. It's built very carefully, so that it's built around the Don Valley, around the topography of the site. It sort of has great sensitivity to its natural context, and it's built in this grand brutalist or heroic style of architecture, as it's sometimes called, that we don't have anymore today. And it's one of these things that, we might not think this building is a masterpiece now, but another 50 years from now, we might feel differently. And that's sort of something that happens with architecture. When the Science Center was commissioned and being built, Victorian buildings and buildings of the 19th century were sort of deeply unpopular with the Canadian public. But we've come, I think, as a country and probably around the world to recognize the sort of beauty of even like 19th century Bay and Gable houses in Toronto, or buildings like the Ontario Legislature, or even early 20th century buildings like Union Station in downtown Toronto. And wouldn't it have been a shame if we had torn those down 50 years ago? So for all those reasons, it's sort of historical importance. It's evocative of a particular type of style. And for me, not just that, it's also evocative of the centennial, of this era in Canadian history when we really had this great sense of optimism. We believed in building big things. We built projects like this one that were sort of massively ambitious. And Ontario Place, incidentally, is another one of that era. And I think it would be a real shame to lose the relics of that era. And in doing so, I think we'd lose a little bit of that spirit too.
I heard Kinga Sermon, who I think is the infrastructure minister, on an interview, and she was saying that there's a business case to rebuild it afresh, the Science Center, because the lack of attention to maintenance and repair in the past decade or longer is such that it would cost more to fix it up than to just demolish it and start anew. Does that make any sense?
No, it doesn't make any sense. I think it's an assertion that there's a business case, and the whole thing, to me, certainly feels like it's a bit of a back of the napkin plan, this whole Ontario Science Center, Ontario Place sort of land swap that I don't think it's been thought out all that carefully. But beyond that, in principle, in general, both for sort of fiscal reasons and for environmental reasons, it generally makes more sense to maintain and preserve and then sort of retrofit and renovate a building than to tear it down and build a new one. In this case, it's notwithstanding the architectural building value that building may or may not have, it tends to be a lot more carbon intensive to have to get rid of all that concrete, then rebuild something completely anew, which is sort of environmentally insensitive compared to keeping what's there and retrofitting it. So in the architectural world, many of us sort of believe in this axiom of never demolish unless it's really absolutely necessary. And with the Science Center, it isn't so much that it's necessary, it's just that the building's been poorly maintained. It's a crisis of bad maintenance. And the solution of that is to actually do the deferred maintenance. I'd be really surprised, shocked in fact, if a public facility of any quality could be built at a lower cost by demolishing and then rebuilding that site rather than, maintaining and preserving and renovating this one. I don't think it makes any sense fiscally. I don't think it makes any sense from an environmental standpoint. I don't think it makes any sense from a sort of historical, cultural standpoint either.
I tend to agree with you. I was involved in a development where we were looking at destroying a stadium that was built primarily out of concrete, and the cost of taking it down and separating the rebar steel from the concrete and then putting it in landfill was unbelievable, even if the landfill frankly would accept it. And the transportation cost of trucking it out to the landfill was extensive. We're going to take a break and come back in just 2 minutes and talk a little bit more about Science Centre Ontario Place and some of the other issues associated with the discussion of this big, huge spa on the lakefront, and how the Ontario line, which I thought was going to go from the Science Centre from Ontario Place, actually sort of, plays into this whole discussion. Stay with us. Back in 2. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. The topic tonight is this discussion that's going on in the Toronto Mayoralty campaign that's just started. Frankly, I'm not even sure if it's started. I guess it has. In regards to, number one, building a spa at Ontario Place, and number two, this idea that just came up this past week about taking down the Ontario Science Centre and moving it to Ontario Place. My guest is Stefan Novakovic. He is a senior editor at Azure Magazine. He's a Toronto-based journalist. He specializes in architecture and urbanism. Stefan, what's urbanism?
Well, urbanism, in a nutshell, it's a good question, Brian. It's just the life of the city. So that can range from anything to, housing, to transportation, to public parks, to how we move around the city. So there's a particular sort of range of issues like public transit, like something like the Ontario line, or like big public facilities like the Science Centre and like Ontario Place, that sort of these types of issues only really happen at a scale of big cities. And that's why we sort of call it urbanism. In sort of rural communities or in sort of smaller towns, you're not going to be dealing with huge controversies about subway projects. You're not going to be dealing with huge sort of public facilities such as this. So there's really, I think, a sort of particular type of expertise and a particular thought process that comes into play when we look at the life of cities. And that's why we have a word for it.
Okay, so let me ask you an urbanism question, if I could. This Ontario line, which is the new subway that is supposed to go from, interesting enough, the Science Centre to Ontario Place. I had explained that one of the big benefits was that you had this center of gravity, this tourist attraction at both ends, the Science Centre at the north end and Ontario Place at the south end. And the vast majority of current subway GO train usage is the gravitational pull of the financial district downtown. So everyone goes inbound in the morning and outbound in the evening. And it was explained to me that one of the big benefits of having the terminus in the north being Science Centre and the terminus in the south being Ontario Place is that was almost free capacity, because the capacity was already there. The trains were traveling back out and not taking commuters because they were going the opposite direction, and they could take students or tourists or whatnot to that place. And the example that was provided to me is that something like 25% of the people at Yorkdale Shopping Centre come by way of transit, and they're going in the opposite direction than the commuter would typically go. Makes a similar logic to have the terminus of the Scarborough subway being the Scarborough Town Centre. And then, I had two different people comment about the logic of having all of Toronto's tourist attractions in one sort of location down by the waterfront. Ripley's Museum, CN Tower, hockey arena, baseball stadium, exhibition place, Ontario Place, a big spa, and the Science Centre. And then I had another person say, well, that's not what you want. You actually want to distribute it around so that you don't have too much concentration and parking and transit and traffic and whatnot in one area. Tell me about, from an urbanism standpoint, what's the right answer in regards to where you should locate these two major tourist attractions from a transit standpoint, from a distribution or concentration in a city? Is there a theory that says one is right versus the other?
Oh, there certainly are. And, one thing that's sometimes difficult for us from an urbanism standpoint is acknowledging that we don't have all the answers and that there isn't a perfect answer, and that I certainly don't know everything, and that people in these communities oftentimes have greater expertise and different viewpoints than I do. But there's a couple of important things. I think you brought up some good points, Brian, about the nature of commuting in Toronto. And for one thing, that it's not just a sort of mono center of just getting people from the rest of the city out to jobs in the financial district. We have a really diversified and polycentric city where places like Yorkdale Mall, places in Scarborough, places in Etobicoke are sort of hubs and community centers in their own right, that should have and deserve their own infrastructure that isn't just solely intended to sort of poor people in downtown. Having said that, the Ontario line, even though the process by which it sort of came about and the way that the Doug Ford government in Ontario has handled it isn't great, actually will, I think, serve a number of really important uses. For one thing, when you look out west, you have communities like Liberty Village, for example, that will be served by the Ontario line, which is this really super high density type of community that doesn't have any higher order transit now, right? So we've built a bunch of these really tall towers over there, and we haven't really given those folks a way to get around en masse. And the Ontario line is going to help do that, which is really important. And the fact that it connects the Science Center with Ontario Place is, I think that's nice. I think it's good branding primarily, and I think that's part of the way it was envisioned as a sort of Ontario brand connecting these attractions. But the more fundamental thing is that it provides sort of day-to-day transit for people living in these communities that have been underserved by transit. And on the east end of the line, it helps take a lot of capacity off of the Yonge line. That's a sort of central spine of Toronto Transit, which has been over capacity and which is really, really busy and has become somewhat dysfunctional. If you've ever been at Yonge and Bloor at about 5 p.m., you'll know what I mean. But then we get into the fact of, the fundamental branding of the line is, Ontario Place down here and the Ontario Science Center down here. And should they be distributed that way? Again, it's the type of thing that there's no ideal answer for, but I tend to think that a city as big and diverse as ours sort of deserves to have more than one center. I don't think that it's particularly equitable in the long term to sort of build a city around everybody pouring into the downtown and serving the downtown and then having to take the subway and a bunch of buses back out there to go home and sleep, unless you happen to be wealthy enough to live close to downtown. So I think it's actually very wise that in the 1960s, as part of the Centennial projects, we built the Science Center at a location that isn't sort of obvious as a tourist hub, as a tourist destination. And I think part of that is just sort of diversifying the economy of the city. But part of that also speaks to the fact that it's not really primarily a tourist attraction. It's not something that we're sort of trying to wring tax dollars out of or trying to get as many people to come visit it from Ohio or whatever as we can. A big part of it is that it's a community center, is that it's a place for kids going to school all across the GTA to come visit and learn and get a tactile, hands-on view of science. And it also has a lot of amenities for people living in the Flemington Park community there. So for those reasons, I sort of think while I really hope we build the Ontario line, and I really hope we do it as soon as possible. And I, with some caveats, I'm a big supporter of the project. I do think that there's a lot of merit in keeping the Science Center up there and in not centralizing it downtown.
I agree with you. And I think this is a point that, hasn't been made. There is a logic to locating different tourist attractions close by one another if they are part of a logical one-day activity. And the Smithsonian, series of museums in Washington is one of the examples that people refer to on an often basis, or frankly, Disney and downtown Disney, or some of the other associated parks. When you spend a certain length of time at one museum and then you're going to spend another time at another museum just down the street, and then another one, the planetarium and the ROM, as an example, close proximity makes a lot of sense. But I don't think, as you said, the Science Center fits that model. The Science Center is, I don't know exactly. I'd love to see the statistics, but I don't think it's primarily a tourist attraction. I think it's primarily an educational attraction. And my bet is the vast majority of people that go to there are going to that activity and then going back to wherever they came from, home or something else. They're not going on to another activity. So I think that logic of close proximity location of tourist attractions doesn't make sense in the Science Center. The other thing that I think makes sense is really what you want to do is you want to be close or as close as possible to all the schools. And if you're on the waterfront, you cut off because of the sort of the lake, the radius to the vast majority of students, and the science center, which is inconvenient, frankly, to come to go to from Mississauga, is probably far more centrally located if you're taking a school bus on a school field trip to get there, and it's even more so with the Eglinton Crosstown and the Ontario line. So I really don't understand this rationale. And then I guess the other thing I want to ask you about is, I understand Flemington Park, which is the neighborhood that is near there, is one of the highest density residential areas in all of Toronto. And they're talking about replacing the Science Center with residential. Does it make sense to take something that's already high density and make it even higher density?
Well, again, it's one of these things. It's a very good question, Brian. So in principle, when you look at a neighborhood from a sort of top-down on pay-per-view, which we should be hesitant to do, then you'd see that there's a neighborhood that already has substantial density and supports it, and it's getting two new major transit projects. It's going to be an intersection of two big transit lines, Eglinton Line 5, the Crosstown, and the Science Center. If you're a transit planner, if you're a sort of urbanist, if you're looking at that on paper, you would say, well, that's a fantastic place to put some additional density. And oftentimes it does work that way, that, the places that are already dense do make more sense to put additional density there. But one of the things we really struggled with, in particular in Toronto, is that we tend to hyper concentrate our density. So if you look at a neighborhood like Yonge and Eglinton, or even if you go further afield in the GTA and look at the downtown of Mississauga or the downtown of Vaughan, you'll sort of see a 60-story tower, 60-story tower, 60-story tower, 50-story tower, and then a 2-story bungalow, right? And we've sort of really struggled to build sort of in between layers of density. And I think that's something that we need to do a better job of spreading that all throughout the city. But having said that, it absolutely makes sense to build housing. It absolutely makes sense. We absolutely need to build a lot of housing, and we need to build a lot of housing that's below market rate. But I think, again, it's another type of thing where, the politicians and the provincial government are sort of muddying the waters, right? They're saying, well, we kind of messed up on this whole Ontario Place thing, so we're going to cover that up by moving the Science Center, and then we're going to cover that up by saying, like, no, we're actually going to build affordable housing on the Science Center site. It's just piling all these problems on one another. That site is already, the way it's designed, the way the Science Center operates, is that it's really in harmony with the ecology of the site, with the Don Valley Ravine, which, by the way, because it's a ravine, because it's a very steep site, because it's in a floodplain, that's not a great place to build a ton of housing, because, as we learned in Hurricane Hazel in the 1950s, these types of sites can get flooded very easily. So there's a lot of, and we have a lot of other publicly owned land. We have plenty of city-owned land where it's not a lack of land that we have. It's really a lack of initiative and a lack of funding that's preventing us from building enough dense, affordable housing in this city. So just by sort of saying that, like, hey, we're going to do it here, I don't really buy it, Brian. I think it's just a political cover for a whole series of other bad moves.
I tend to agree with you. I think that if you take a look at the development that's been proposed at, I think it's Laird and Don Mills, et cetera, on the Eglinton Crosstown, just proximate to the Science Center, it's incredible. It's substantial. It's building something that's almost comparable to, if not Yonge and Eglinton today, Yonge and Eglinton a little while ago. It's incredibly dense. And to add that to Flemington Park, and then add on top of that, redevelopment of the Ontario Science Center lands, I really worry that that's going to be, a ghetto. It's going to be so dense. And it's already, from what I understand, one of the most diverse areas and lower income areas in all of Toronto. So I really worry about the whole urbanism rationale for taking out the Science Center and replacing it with residential development. I really question that.
I think that mass densification in and of itself doesn't really create bad or problematic neighborhoods. The question is, is that density going to be supported by adequate services, by adequate social supports? And one of those things is transit, but transit is just one of those things. Are we going to then build enough schools there? Are we then going to build enough public infrastructure there? Are we going to have enough social programs there? Are we going to have enough libraries there? Are we going to have enough parks in that type of neighborhood? And we really need to consider all of those questions before making these types of decisions. And I think that for the Science Center site, I would be shocked if the provincial government has really given this adequate thought.
I agree with you. I think it's a real issue. We're going to take a break and come back in 2 minutes and talk more and maybe focus a little bit on Ontario Place. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I'm having an interesting conversation tonight with Stefan Novakovic. He's a Toronto-based journalist specializing in architecture and urbanism. He's the senior editor of Azure magazine. He wrote a really interesting piece that I read on Ontario Place and the Science Center and this whole debate that's going on within the Toronto Mayoralty campaign about what should happen. And we were just chatting before we go to Ontario Place, Stefan, we were just chatting about the density that's coming to the area near the Science Center. And I wonder if you want to comment, and for those on videos, I'm showing you a map of the kind of development that's proposed to take place. The development that is already proposed for this around the proximity of the terminus of the Ontario line near the Science Center is unbelievable. Like it's taken that old IBM site at the northwest corner of Don Mills and Eglinton and completely, covering it with towers, as well as to the south, as well as where Flemington Park is. And if you added in that the southwest corner where the Science Center is with residential development, it's going to be bigger than Yonge and Eglinton, isn't it?
Almost. I mean, it's certainly going to look like how we think of Yonge and Eglinton today.
Does that make sense?
Well, on the level of sort of transit access to the city, it is at the intersection of two transit lines. So in a decade, this is going to be one of the best served transit nodes in the city. And from that standpoint, it does make sense to really add substantial density there. But then if you look at this whole map as a whole, the model of building that we've had in this city, you can sort of sum it up with a couple of words of tall and sprawl. So you get a lot of really tall buildings and a lot of buildings that don't have very much density at all. And we've been very bad at finding a middle ground, which I think we ought to do more of. But then when you also look at this site of where the Science Center is, and you look at the mass infusion of density that's already coming there, which I do think fundamentally makes some amount of sense. Then you look at the fact that wouldn't it be a shame to sort of have this new downtown in a way that we're building and deprive it of its prime cultural amenity, of its prime educational and cultural institution, which is the Science Center, right? So wouldn't it be a shame that as we're spending so much money and effort to develop that site, we actually take away one of its most potent sort of sources of cultural richness and diversity? That doesn't make much sense to me.
I agree with you completely. I think the density that's proposed there makes sense, but I think that keeping the Science Center there is key. You end up creating a complete community. You've got residential, you got transit, you got some employment, and you've got this major cultural icon. There are other things there as well. The Aga Khan Museum is up there. So it ends up becoming a real center. And I don't think it makes sense to concentrate everything on the waterfront, particularly as we talked about already, the Science Center. So let's talk about Ontario Place. What do you think, if we can change topics, of this proposal to put a big spa at Ontario Place? Does that make sense?
No.
Why?
It does not make sense. It doesn't make sense on a number of levels. The first one being is really, let's even take this thing at face value and listen to the type of presentation that the Austrian company Therm and that the Toronto-based firm, so it's Urban Strategies and Urban Planning, and Diamond Schmidt, the architects, and various others are sort of proposing for this. They're talking about a facility that's going to see up to 14,000 people a day, and it's going to be a water park full of kids running around. And the way that they're selling it to us fundamentally is as a health and wellness destination. Now, I know that these days it's very popular to use the language of health and wellness, but I can't think of, Brian, a sort of destination that has 14,000 people in it. That does not sound to me like a health and wellness destination. That sounds to me like a theme park. That sounds to me like a water park. So fundamentally, it's really hard to have it both ways. Either this is sort of a Great Wolf Lodge type of water park attraction, or it's a spa. And I think the answer is that it's not really a spa. It's not really a health and wellness destination. It is a place for folks to go and spend money, and it's a business that we're building on the waterfront. Is there a particular demand for that in Toronto? Is it worth sacrificing our public land and one of the most beautiful pieces of public space that we have around it when we see that it already has successful parks, successful beaches like Trillium Park around it? Is it worth sacrificing those to build a privatized space? Furthermore, is it worth for us to, in order to sort of feed this business amenity, which is essentially what this is, a business, is it worth it for the public sector to provide a huge tax subsidy for them to build an underground parking garage, basically under Lake Ontario, in one of like the worst possible places to build that type of underground car-centric infrastructure when we're trying to build a more sort of multimodal and environmentally friendly and pedestrian and cyclist friendly and transit friendly city? It just doesn't make sense to me on any level. The level that it does kind of make sense on is that these renderings, these images do look really cool. I think it looks like it will be a really fun place to be. And we had that sort of similar type of utopia when we were looking at the Sidewalk Labs plan, which was Google's plan also to privatize a big plot of land, but moreover a piece of city governance in order for them to run it. So when you look at something like this, you look at schemes like this and what they're doing at Ontario Place, there's a huge wow factor to it. I certainly won't deny that. And it's a type of wow factor that our public sector, our municipality and our provincial government could never really compete with today on the level of public spending. And I think that's sort of where the real part of issue of this is for me. When we first built Ontario Place, which is also another, I think, a tremendously evocative piece of architecture by Eberhard Zeidler. And when we built the Science Center too, we built those in a great era, in a sort of golden age of public investment and thinking big. And today we don't have that anymore. And our only alternative to something of that scale, to something that's that sort of publicly impressive, is to sell this plan of a private water park. And I think that, to me, it's a real shame that we lose a public and democratic space, to sell people tickets for water slides.
One of the justifications, I guess, is that Ontario Place has also fallen into I don't know what the right word is, disuse. It's not being utilized.
Who let that happen?
So whose fault is it? What should happen?
Exactly. And that's the big question, both with the Science Center, which, by the way, also faces like huge budget shortfalls in its maintenance, and bits of the Science Center, including its really iconic bridge and parts of the building, have been shut down, are no longer used. Ontario Place, of course, has been shuttered entirely. And what that shows is that it's the public sector sort of demonstrating like, hey, we're inept. We're not able to do this. We can't fund adequate maintenance of these types of facilities that we built 50 years ago. Then following that type of logic, the next step is to think that, well, obviously the public sector has been incapable of being a steward to these types of facilities, and we can't allow that to happen. And then we create this sort of dichotomy where we have one option, which is public governance, in which we essentially leave Ontario Place to rot, or we have privatization, in which we, allow it to be saved, but that at the expense of essentially turning it into a private business. And Brian, for me, most fundamentally, that is a dichotomy that I refuse to buy into. I believe that, the public sector was able to do this 50 years ago, and it should be able to do it today. And why it isn't, why we've allowed these sort of great and really democratic and really open public amenities to fall into this type of disrepair, that's the big type of question for me. Because when you look at Ontario Place, part of the beauty of what it provided was it was a public facility that again, like the Science Center, was really a great place for kids, especially lower income kids, who maybe didn't have the opportunity for their parents to send them to summer camp in the summer, or maybe who didn't have cottages to go away to in Muskoka. And for those kids, for lower income kids, and for the immigrant kids that sort of made up this city, it provided a place, a public venue where you could sort of experience the beauty of Canadian outdoor life without being rich. And I can see the value in why we provided that. And the question is why we as a public, as a Canadian public, as an Ontario public, and from the standpoint of the government, why we decided no longer to support that. That's the real question here, at least as far as I'm concerned.
I agree with you. I think it is a little bit ironic and frankly a shame that something called Ontario Place is being rebuilt by an Austrian spa company. I think that Ontario should be able to do it on its own. I used to work with the Walt Disney Company, and one of the key principles for any one of the Disney parks is you had to keep it new. You had to renew it, and every second year, a brand new attraction would open, and you had to keep adding to it. Canada's Wonderland, a private enterprise, I think has done a great job of keeping it new and has been adding new roller coasters, new events, new something or other. Ontario Place hasn't done a thing other than maybe a new amphitheater. Why is it that we've done such a lousy job with public ownership of the Science Center and Ontario Place?
That's the question I'm wondering too. As a matter of fact, when the Science Center opened, the architect Raymond Moriyama really stressed that the program and the kind of exhibitions that they had ought to be renewed, that it ought to function on a sort of 8-year cycle where the place is a living thing that's evolving and changing with the times. And I think that, the private sector, certainly from a business standpoint, understands that. We ought to be able to understand it too. And it's a question to me that I think there's been certainly a retreat of state capacity, of social programs, of the welfare state in the, global north, in countries like Canada, the United States, and the United Kingdom writ large since the 1970s. Whether you want to call that neoliberalism or something else, the root causes of that are difficult to understand. They certainly go beyond my specialty in urbanism to be able to uncipher. But I think that that's sort of the bigger question of why we allowed something like that to happen.
Both these architects that you've mentioned for both Ontario Place and the Science Center are really internationally renowned architects, and both facilities are thought of as great examples of their architecture and really have a heritage significance. Is that not the case?
It's absolutely the case. Raymond Moriyama and Eberhard Zeidler are two of the most globally influential architects of the 20th century. And both of them were working right here in Toronto. And for both of them, their work is threatened. And we've made some similar types of mistakes in the past. When you look at some of the older photos of Toronto, of Yonge Street at the turn of the 20th century, there was this sort of incredible amount of 19th century Victorian ornate buildings that today we look back at them and we think they were really beautiful. And what the heck were we thinking that we could have torn them down? And we almost did the same thing, for example, with Kensington Market, which today is one of the most beloved neighborhoods in the city and a huge tourist destination and a huge generator of revenue and income and culture for the city. And we almost tore that down in the 1960s and 70s to build an expressway, the Spadina Expressway. And so when we have the benefit of hindsight and posterity, some of these decisions seem quite shocking. And I believe that if we allow Ontario Place and the Science Center to not be preserved and to not be protected as they deserve to be, in hindsight, we will look back on those decisions with, possibly even greater regret than what we've done so far.
Why are we doing this?
It's on some level, I'm tempted to say that I blame the Ford government and their ideology and their refusal to really engage with meaningful public spending and public support. And maybe in a narrow sense, that's true, but it's really an issue that sort of even, I think, to some degree, transcends partisan politics. You know, when you look at the conservative governments of Bill Davis in the 90s, there was a lot more support for the arts and for public amenities. So that is a question. I don't know the answer to that question, Brian, fundamentally. But what I do know is that we as Ontarians, as Torontonians, as Canadians, need to be asking ourselves that question and need to be putting it to our politicians. Why are we doing this? Don't let them get away with the narrative of, here's some really beautiful pictures of the water park that's going to be at Ontario Place. Isn't that going to be great? Here's a half-baked notion of how we're going to move the Science Centre into Ontario Place. Isn't that going to be great? Here's a back of the napkin plan of how we're actually going to use that Science Centre site to build a bunch of affordable housing, even though the site is not particularly well suited to building mass housing. Don't let them get away with that story. Instead, we ought to ask them, why are you doing this? And what this is the abdication of civic responsibility and the abdication of public responsibility to really look after the culture and the education and the well-being of our city. Why are we letting them do that? So I don't know the answer to that, but I do know that that's the way we need to frame the question. And I do know that ahead of at least the Toronto mayoral by-election that's happening in June, I think it ought to be an important question. So like you, Brian, I sort of agree that it's kind of weird that the Ontario Place and the Science Centre have sort of emerged as such big issues politically at a time when we, sort of face a really acute, housing crisis, equity crisis, at a time when we can't seem to even get to the bottom of what's happening with the Eglinton Crosstown and why Metrolinx hasn't finished that. But at the same time, these issues of the Ontario Place and the Science Centre really are, I think, microcosms of a much bigger political question of why have we allowed this to happen.
An abdication of civic responsibility, an abdication of public responsibility. Great lines. I wish you were running for mayor. Unbelievable. We're going to take a break and come back with some concluding comments in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. My guest tonight has been Stefan Novakovic. He's a Toronto-based journalist specializing in architecture and urbanism. He is the senior editor of Azure magazine, and we've had, I think, a really good conversation about Ontario Place, the Ontario Science Centre, and his last line was a crisis of civic responsibility and of public responsibility. And I think that really is something that we should be thinking about, because we have collectively, via our municipal and provincial governments, let both Ontario Place and the Ontario Science Centre fall into disrepair, low attendance, misuse, non-use, etc. And these are their public realm, their public benefits, their public facilities. They're part of our heritage. Great architectural examples of two great architects and two great eras of construction and architecture and design that we should have done a better job of keeping. I want to give you, if I could, Stefan, a couple of examples of redevelopments that I think make a ton of sense. And I want to challenge you to see if you have got some others. I used to live in Vancouver. Granville Island was just an industrial wasteland. Canada Lands, the federal government, completely redeveloped it. And the start of it, the kernel of it, was a farmer's market. But then, great universities, art galleries, lots of private businesses, great walking trail around the waterfront, water taxis. It became, after Stanley Park, probably the number one most interesting part of Vancouver. I did some work, as I mentioned, with the Walt Disney Company, taking a look at city center developments. And one of the best worldwide is Tivoli Gardens in Copenhagen. I'm not sure if you've ever been there or taken a look at it, but it really is a spectacular amusement park / garden in the middle of downtown Copenhagen. It's just incredible, and it's been there for a couple hundred years, and it's gorgeous, and it attracts people, and it is an attraction, and it is in places privatized because there's a lot of different private operators that are there, but it's also a garden, and it's a place where people go for cultural activities. It's a place where it's both all seasons, all year long. People go there, and they go there for restaurants, they go there for shopping, they go there for entertainment, they go there for attractions, and they go there for green space. There are other places in this world that do a far better job of this urban theme parks, urban attractions than we do. What do you think we should be looking at, if any, as an example of what we could do at either Ontario Place or at the Science Centre?
Well, I'm really glad that you brought up both those examples. And I think in general, it's important for us to have a broad global scope of how we look at these issues. And if you sort of look at one of the most, at least if you're looking at a business case, one of the most commercially successful parks in the world of the last 15, 20 years, and certainly in North America, is just the High Line in New York City. Now, that hasn't been a huge success as far as sort of improving public equity there, but it's been a huge, huge tourist attraction without a particular degree of amenitization. It's just a walking trail. It's just a park. So you don't necessarily need all the bells and whistles of these attractions in order to do that. But moreover, I think sometimes as architects and landscape architects and in urbanism, we sort of get bogged down with the idea of thinking that there's some perfect innovative concept that we can come up with that can help solve what's happening at these sites. But the reality is much more prosaic. There already was a successful model for Ontario Place and a pretty successful model for the Science Centre. And those models should have evolved with the times. But instead, what we let happen is that we just stopped funding them. That was the fundamental problem. It's not that we are lacking some new cool urban paradigm from Denmark or from Norway that's going to help us fix this. It's the fact that we lost out on the funding and we don't know how to do it. One thing I kind of like from Josh Matlow is that for some of his ideas, the way he's going to fund them is just by saving money by, tearing down the Gardiner Expressway instead of rebuilding that thing. And we sort of need to ask ourselves as Torontonians where our civic priorities lie. If we can find $1 billion to rebuild an aging expressway, but too bad, too sad for Ontario Place and the Science Centre.
I completely agree with you. And I like the example of the High Line. I've been in both Dallas, Texas and Tampa, Florida recently, met with developers. And both times they made an interesting comment that I really think is intriguing. They said that green space is the new anchor. Used to be a big shopping center or a big Ferris wheel or a big something or other, but green space is the new anchor because we're all desperate for green space. And you talk about the High Line and it not being amenitized, whatever the word is. You're right and you're wrong. The High Line is green space and it's spectacular green space, but private developers have brought amenities to it on almost every one of the stairways that comes down. And that big Italian food mark at the south end and some of the other attractions as you go up farther north wouldn't have been nearly as successful if it wasn't for the traffic that was brought to them by
That's right.
the High Line. I ended up, I was chairman of an organization called the Mississauga City Summit at one point in time, and we had Ken Greenberg, who is a well-known urbanist, come and speak. And he said one of the best examples of the power of green space is Ambleside Beach in West Vancouver. And he said the key to success there is that half of the walk is green with parks and the waterfront, but then half of the walk is commercial with retails and coffee shops and grocery stores, et cetera. And he said, too often we're too either idealistic or private industry oriented. We want either just the shopping district or we want the green space. What people really want is to spend some time in green space, but then they want to have a beer or they want to grab a coffee or they want to sit down or they want to get some retail therapy. And having that combination, which Granville Island allows you to do, which the High Line allows you to do, which this big, beautiful new development on the waterfront in Tampa allows you to do, which Tivoli Gardens allows you to do, which frankly Luxembourg Gardens in Paris and Central Park in New York allow you to do. We need people like you to reimagine the Science Centre and Ontario Place. Thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Brian. It's been a pleasure.
That's our show for tonight. Thanks for joining us. I remind you, I'm on every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 AM. You can stream me online at www.saga960am.ca. All my podcasts and videocasts are available on briancrombie.com, on all social media and all podcast places. Stefan, real pleasure meeting you, and thanks for joining us. Good night, everybody.
Likewise.